Well, welcome to the first in our autumn series of the Ancient History Seminar, and it's a very great pleasure to see everybody here and actually to kick off the term properly at last with intellectual activity rather than running around filling forms, panicking about where your classroom is, etc., etc. And the theme today for this term is gender and sexuality from Lydia to Theodora, which Kate and I have been putting together. Before we get to our main event, the first speaker in the series, I'd just say a few words about why we came up with this topic and why we've chosen to do this topic. And maybe use that as a way of introducing the themes for the series. There is a list of seminars which has gone around, which I already know needs amending in terms of rooms as of this morning. But further notice will be given of that, and that's not until November anyhow. What happens for deciding the series is that some point during the term, and the teachers of ancient history in the University of London have a meeting. We all sit around and we decide what we're going to do. And when we did that last, Kate had already suggested that we should learn something on gender, and we got the first slot as we were going through. And actually, we've not done anything on gender in the seminar series for quite some time. We've done lots of other things. We've done household, we've done aspects of family, but gender hasn't fallen under our remit. And that's in some ways a little odd. It's odd in part because this seminar series, if you go back far enough to even before I was a lad, has a distinguished history of gender studies. Back in 1983, Avril Cameron and Rickert published the groundbreaking Images of Women in Antiquity, which we'll still go back to, and which derived from this seminar series and the talks therein. Gender has figured in other seminar series, and about 4 years ago, Greg Wolf ran a conference on empire and gender in the Institute of Classical Studies. But when I started looking at how we were going to organise this seminar and what had been done recently, it struck me that there was an enormous amount of interest in gender history, and this was as the Women's Classical Committee was kicking off and becoming more important within the organisation of the classics community in the UK. But actually, the amount of work, certainly from UK writers, historians, archaeologists, was rather disparate. The literary scholars, very focused, done lots and lots on gender. There's a little bit more in the archaeology. But the historians, compared with, say, our modern history colleagues, have been somewhat less focused on the issue. And that's interesting. And we sort of wondered why that might be. And I think one of the reasons that might be is because it's difficult to write gender history. There are issues, and there's questions about how to engage with that. And this is, of course, a political sphere at the moment, both institutionally and in terms of the increased sophistication with which gender has been discussed in society in general over the last 10 years. In fact, if you were to think of a kind of social topic where the discourse has changed most markedly in the last 10 years, it is probably going to be around gender and sexuality. So what we have in this series is a whole series of different approaches to the writing about gender in essentially the Roman Empire, from the more biographical to the more social. And what we hope will emerge from the series is a cross-section of methodologies and approaches by which contemporary scholars are engaging with this complex and difficult field. And who better to kick us off on that than Beth Severy Hoven, who we've flown in at massive expense to her institution, from the States, from Macalester College, and we're very pleased to have brought to London. Beth will probably be known to most of you from her book on Augustus and the family at the birth of the Roman Empire, so very good to get her in first, from 2003. She's also written on master narratives, wall painting in the house of the Vetii, on gender, sex, and the domestication of empire in an article, and you into that volume as well, New Priorities, in 2007. A very, very good, interesting volume. On Germanicus, in an article on family and state in the early imperial monarchy from 2000. And those of you who haven't yet been bombarded by the Roman Society should know that Beth will be starring on Saturday at an event, I think in this room, run by the Roman Society on Germanicus to celebrate is the right word, the 2,000 years and 2 days since the death of Germanicus. 2 days, I think, is very important. And she's also published an edition of the Satyricon of the Trains in 2014. She's currently working on Augustan womanhood again, and she is writing a book on Octavia, and she's going to speak to us today about Octavia. This isn't a misprint, obviously. I do make many misprints. And I sent out the publicity. I thought, oh my goodness, I just repeated first. There was nice little red lines on it. But Octavia, first lady of Rome. Beth.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? All right, wonderful. First, I want to very much extend my thanks to Richard and to Kate for inviting me. I spent a year as a graduate student at New College at Oxford, longer ago than I will admit publicly, and I used to be a regular here at the Ancient History Seminar on then Wednesday afternoons, so I'm honored to be back as a speaker. Next, I need to acknowledge the source of my title. In an article of 2016, Alessandra Valentini calls for a book-length study of Octavia, arguing she was the First Lady of Rome. I'm in the process of writing said monograph for the Oxford Women in Antiquity series, and I think it's an apt honorific. Octavia came of age in the late Republic. Her 2 marriages encompassed 2 major periods of civil war, and then she witnessed what emerged of Rome on the other side. She's a useful figure to focus on in considering this pivotal period. Today I aim to analyze 3 ways in which Octavia participated in changes to ways that elite Roman women engaged in public life, where in some way she might be considered a first. 2 of these helped set precedent going forward and thus are part of the change from the Republic to the Empire. The 3rd was largely discarded and thus serves as a sign of the experimentation that was underway. The 3 phenomena are first, her residency in the provinces. Octavia lived with Antony in Athens, a relatively unprecedented move that became common among young imperial women in the Julio-Claudian period and standard practice for wives of provincial governors. Second, Octavia figured prominently on coinage from 39 to 37 BCE, which was not seen again to that degree until the time of her great-granddaughter, Agrippina the Younger. Third, her building program, both in specific terms of sponsoring the construction of a portico associated with a sun, and in general terms as a female funding public architecture, Octavia kicks off a major trend of the imperial period. Our first two phenomena emerge from the first few years of Octavia's marriage to Antony, a marriage arranged to shore up his alliance with her brother, Octavian, in the late 40 BCE. One of Octavia's relatively unprecedented actions from this period was going with her husband to live in the provinces, specifically in Athens. Before this time, elite Roman wives had largely remained in Rome during a husband's service abroad or even in exile. Cicero's first wife, Terentia, forms a helpful guide to how these practices changed at the end of the Republic. Terentia and Cicero barely considered the possibility that she would accompany him into exile in 58 BCE. And in the capital, she and their daughter were instrumental in keeping Cicero informed and even negotiating for his return. Nor did she travel with him to his governorship in Cilicia in 51. The subsequent civil wars, however, unsettled this tradition. Terentia and Cicero debated at length whether she and Tullia should stay in Rome as Caesar moved about Italy in 49. Cicero observed in a letter to her, and I'll show some Latin up here, hopefully. I'm translating mostly what's highlighted in blue. But this is his letter of concern. I see that all the good men have left Rome and they have their women with them. Consider what other women are doing in this position. This and other letters weigh concerns over food shortages and pillaging, as well as the political import, the political message of remaining in the capital at this time. During the same period, Pompey's wife Cornelia accompanied him to Lesbos and on to Egypt, where Pompey was killed. After the assassination of Caesar in 44, and especially after the proscription of late 43, more and more women began to flee with their male relatives. And this is a map of some key places I'll mention. Documented examples of these women in flight include Antony's mother Julia and a young Livia, escaping to Sicily and then on to cities in mainland Greece. Others, however, stayed in Italy, such as Brutus's mother Servilia, who successfully changed a senatorial decree in her son's favor. Fulvia, Antony's wife just before Octavia, followed a complex path among these options. Although Cicero publicly chastised Antony for having her at his military camp in Brundisium in 44, most of the time she remained in and around Rome during the chaotic months following the death of Caesar, and she was instrumental in protecting Antony's position with leading senators. When Antony went east, following the settlement of 42 BCE, she stayed in Italy and worked with Antony's brother Lucius to maintain loyalty to their family among veterans and others, work that came to the point of appearing as military leadership. She was herself caught up in the siege of Perugia in northern Italy. That's a site marked here in northern Italy on the map. Only after its capitulation did she flee to Antony in Greece. The exigencies of civil war, which had gone on with only brief pauses since Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49, almost a full decade, were changing the way elite women moved about the empire. Before, such women had regularly traversed Italy, but now Italy itself could be the military zone. And so they also moved out into the larger empire, at one moment because it was safer, at other times as part of political maneuvering. Octavia's move to Athens in 39 was informed by these precedents. Women could accomplish much as representatives of their families in the capital and across Italy, but it was not always safe, and the independence of their action could also complicate matters. They or their male relatives were sometimes finding their presence elsewhere in the empire more prudent in the moment, now that that option had been created. Even so, the only specific example known to us of a wife going with a high-ranking magistrate to live in a province in relative peacetime is Sulla's wife Cornelia, who also went with him to Athens in 86. And I think there's some thinking to do there about Athens and parts of Greece as feeling like an extension of Rome at this point. Now we need to keep in mind that elite women were preceded into the provinces by wives of merchants and tax collectors and others, for whom we have evidence well back into the 1st century BCE. But Octavia's move was unusual for a woman of her rank and established practice going forward. In the Augustan period, we have good evidence, especially for younger women in the imperial family. Different map, different period. Especially for younger women in the imperial family, traveling with their husbands abroad. Julia, Augustus's daughter, traveled with Agrippa in the eastern Mediterranean as part of his proconsular command in the teens BCE. And the next generation, Agrippina the Elder, lived with her husband Germanicus on the Rhine frontiers in the early teens CE, and some of their children were born there on the edge of the empire. By early in the reign of Tiberius, a tradition had evolved for the wives of provincial governors to serve abroad with their husbands, perhaps related to the second emperor's habit of extending these commands for rather long periods. Within a few years, the wives of legates, procurators, and quaestors had followed suit. So not only was Agrippina with Germanicus in Syria when he died in 19, but so was the wife of the recently removed governor. Her name was Plancina, and she had to be rescued by the intercession of Livia when her husband Piso was blamed for the death of the imperial prince. And that is my teaser for the Germanicus conference of the Roman Society this Saturday. Tacitus subsequently reports on a debate held in the Senate on whether it was appropriate or not for senatorial wives to reside in the provinces. The proposal to forbid the practice failed. The reach of this change was vast and really should not be underestimated. The wooden tablets preserved at the remote military outpost of Vindolanda in Roman Britain from the late 1st to early 2nd century CE document the residence in camp of the wife of the equestrian rank commander. While Augustus forbade common soldiers to marry, and I know on the ground that is different, the official word was common soldiers were forbidden to be married, his female relatives and their non-imperial peers established a different official practice for high-ranking officers in both military and civilian provincial settings. The presence of elite Roman women in the provinces is one mark of the change from the Republic to the Empire. With this complex context in mind, we can speculate about the motives for and the effects of Octavia's presence in Athens. Octavian, Antony, and/or Octavia may have thought it helpful for her to maintain a close tie with her husband as a line of communication between the triumvirs during Antony's continuing deployment in the east. This certainly kept her closer to Antony than Fulvia had been in Italy. We might also interpret her presence as a feature of the developing intention of Antony to center his future in the eastern Mediterranean, an interest that I'll revisit in a moment. While abroad, Octavia could have developed personal connections with local royal and elite families. Appian is an interesting source on this. He briefly recounts Antony's settlements in this winter with various kings and their agreement to contribute to his Parthian campaign. And then in the next paragraph, Appian emphasizes that Octavia attended public festivals and athletic events with her husband in this period. As Josiah Osgood concludes from the epigraphic archives of Aphrodisias in this period, quote, to survive in the triumviral period, you needed not just decrees of the Roman Senate, but also the help of one of the triumvirs. Female relatives of said triumvirs could provide that access point. Octavia went on to utilize these connections well after the war between her relatives, as she arranged marriages, for example, for the children of Antony and Cleopatra. So the first phenomenon is important, but a little visually boring. I had to fill in those maps. So we'll move on to some images in the second one to try to keep you awake this afternoon. When the newlyweds moved to Athens in the fall of 39, public honors for Octavia became part and parcel of the complex presentation of her triumviral husband in this period. Portrayed on coins, named and even deified in a few inscriptions, Octavia experienced an almost unprecedented public presence for a Roman matron. These honors drew inspiration from earlier experiments of the civil wars and local traditions of Hellenistic monarchies to innovate within the shifting socio-political landscape of the triumviral period. Of particular interest to me are some coins, gold, silver, and bronze, featuring Octavia's portrait and minted in areas under Antony's authority. I do have to give the disclaimer that she is not identified by name in any coin legends, so we are assuming we have identified her correctly. That's my proviso. A fine example, and probably the first, is a single surviving specimen of a gold aureus from an unknown mint, which displays the head of Antony in profile on the obverse, and the reverse, a draped bust of a Roman matron. The distinctive hairstyle with a loop of hair braided and pulled up over the head to a very low bun identifies this as a contemporary woman rather than a goddess. Antony's titles in Latin place the coin in 39. The coin resembles others struck at this time that show the profile portrait of Antony and Octavian, one on each side. Such images produced under both triumvirs, and you can tell who produced it by who gets the obverse side of the coin, proclaim the message of their alliance. The coins with Octavia use another means of articulating that alliance. We should place this image in the context of the very recent experiment of putting any living humans on a Roman coin. Since its beginning in the 3rd century BCE, Republican coinage had featured on the obverse the profile head or bust of a goddess or a god. Mint magistrates began to use images of famous ancestors only in the mid-50s BCE. This is a coin of Brutus. And Julius Caesar seems to have been the first living Roman portrayed on a Republican coin, although the dating of this series is pretty debated. Shortly after his death, a portrait of Antony in mourning appeared on the obverse of the denarius. And from here onwards, the profile faces of the highest-ranking male political leaders often occupied the obverses of Roman coins. Antony was thus a key player in the transformation of numismatic tradition, and we can see him and his colleagues continuing to experiment in the years following. In particular, while legendary female figures such as Tarpeia had occasionally been featured on earlier reverses, these coins depicting Octavia are candidates for the first coins from Rome to portray a living woman. Intriguingly, the other candidates display what may be portraits of Antony's previous wife, Fulvia. In the late 40s, a distinctive obverse image of a female bust with tips of wings at the base. And here you can see a little tip of her wing. And here you can see a little tip of her wing. On this one, it's off the flan a little bit, so it's very, you can't see. But this one has a very nice rendering of the portrait face, so I wanted to include that one. This woman with the wings was used on coins from Gaul. That's the silver example up on the top. A city briefly called Fulvia in Phrygia. That's this coin. And there's a few from the Mint of Rome. While the wings are attributes of the goddess Victoria, the face on the bust has what Susan Wood calls portrait-like features that would not appear in idealized images of goddesses, including the distinctive contemporary hairstyle and the sagging chin line. And that's very evident in the one up in the corner. I sympathize with Fulvia. Scholars have not universally accepted the identification as Fulvia. The chronology of the coins is very difficult to work out, and in some of the likely moments when the coins were made, it seems highly unlikely the mint at Rome would knowingly mint coins with images of the wife of Antony. But since the mints of Gaul and Rome did not have local traditions of depicting living women on coins, whoever she may be on these coins of the late 40s, she does provide some Roman precedent for the numismatic images of Octavia just a few years later. In addition to a willingness of Antony or his staff to advertise the value of his female political partners, we can observe here experimentation with regional traditions. And so now I'm going to shift to the silver issues. In their weight and imagery, they gesture to Attalid coinage, but they use portrait styles from royal couples from the Ptolemaic and even Seleucid dynasties. A series of coins probably minted in Ephesus illustrate this. They're dated to 39 by Antony's titles, which are provided in Latin. And these coins display on the obverse conjoined portraits of Antony and Octavia, that is, one behind the other facing in the same direction. The weight and the reverse side of the coins place the objects within a long tradition of coinage in Asia Minor. These are the Christophori, or coins bearing the image of a kista. That's the chest sacred to Dionysus, and Dionysus is standing on the kista on the reverse on this particular example. Christophori had been introduced in cities of Asia Minor under the Attalid dynasty sometime in the early to mid 2nd century BCE. Standardized imagery includes an obverse with the eponymous kista, the box, with a serpent emerging from it, encircled by a wreath, and a reverse displaying 2 snakes wound around a bow inside its case. When Attalus III bequeathed his kingdom to Rome, local mints continued to strike these coins in large numbers. There's a break in production in the middle of the 1st century BCE, but when they resume, the names of Roman governors begin to appear on them in Latin. So Antony and Octavia's Christophori participated in a very local and very long-lived coinage series. The divine associations of the imagery, Dionysus and Heracles with the bow, worked particularly well for Antony's self-presentation in this period. Plutarch highlights these same 2 deities as his key patrons, just as Heracles and Dionysus were of the Attalid kings. The coins thus tied both Antony and Octavia as a pair to a prosperous local past and the divine patronage that provided it. But another tradition from which the Ephesian double portrait draws is of other Hellenistic dynasties, especially the Ptolemies, who created and favored the conjoined portrait of a male and female ruler. This arrangement is also used in a couple of examples in some Seleucid coinages. Hans Mobius calls Antony and Octavia's conjoined portrait a sensational innovation. I just love that phrase, it's sensational. Since in previous Roman coinage, the conjoined portrait had been reserved for deities or personifications. Ann Kuttner argues that the Latin inscriptions and recycled Attalid images of the triumviral Christophori, quote, addressed a mixed Roman and Asian audience, those in the general's pay and those to whom the coins would circulate, soldiers, magistrates, businessmen. The conjoined portrait adds to the mix Ptolemaic claims and audiences. Although these gold and silver issues are relatively small, they're not unique. Variations on these themes appear in contemporary Christophori from an unknown mint. Antony's portrait is on the reverse, and a small bust of Octavia hovers above the kista on the reverse. Can you see her between the snakes? From the year 38 or 37, we have 2 more gold coins. This is one example, possibly from the same unknown mint, with a portrait of Antony or Octavia on each side. And finally, we have a set of bronzes, known to scholars as the fleet coinage, since they're signed by Antony's fleet prefects, Lucius Calpurnius Bibulus, Lucius Sempronius Atratinus, and Marcus Oppius Capito. They're not in great shape. They don't make beautiful pictures. They're bronze and they wear. Their precise dating and production sites are heavily debated, but in general, they're placed in the early 30s and in the Eastern Mediterranean. The reverses are appropriate to the fleet setting. We get ship's beaks, galleys at full sail, sometimes multiple ones, stacked up behind each other, and hippocamps pulling a quadriga. That's up in the far right-hand corner. The obverses display portrait heads and busts of Octavia, Antony, and Octavian in varying configurations. My favorite is a tressus of Capito that has conjoined heads of the two triumvirs facing a single bust of Octavia. It's interesting to ponder the audience for these images. These bronzes are smaller denominations that are tied to the silver denarii that are first arriving in the Eastern Empire at this particular moment. They include a Greek letter, so this is a gamma, the number 3, and a triskelis, again the number 3, to help people not familiar with these denominations know that this is a tressus. So this is in part for an Eastern audience more used to royal women on coins, as we have discussed, but these are also military issues that celebrate the fleets and their commanders. The designer of this image assumed that military audience would not only know of Octavia's role in connecting the two most powerful triumvirs, but would celebrate her for that. Even so, this numismatic celebration of powerful Roman women was not carried forward into the empire, and we should think about why. During and after the war, Octavian and his supporters presented Antony as having lost his Roman identity and masculinity under the influence of his ally Cleopatra. Not having your women in line and presenting oneself as a Hellenistic monarch were part of what was wrong with Antony and were to be avoided in presenting the victor Octavian, who soon became Augustus. Augustus's women were models of in line, right? They made his homespun clothing, his wife and daughter. At least the anecdotes tell us that. So the experiment conducted in the fleet coinages in particular was not reproduced in Augustan issues in Rome or elsewhere for the military. Some of the innovations were not entirely discarded, however. There are a few small issues of Christophery in particular, with conjoined portraits of Octavian and Livia. They're minted in 29 to 27 BC, so before he becomes Augustus and gets rid of that whole idea. And then otherwise, his wife is about absent from Augustus's coins. She reappears under her son, Tiberius. The iconography on the Christophery was then again repeated by Claudius and Agrippina the Younger many years later. So let's move on, you'll be relieved to hear, to my third analysis and my final phenomenon, Octavia as a sponsor of public architecture. We're moving forward in time to after the death of Antony and the first few years of Augustus's tenure as sole ruler. Scholars have discussed the ways Augustus first tried to reopen the playing field for elite competition in Rome. Others hold triumphs, renovated or built buildings, for example, but gradually more and more of these avenues were cut off, and we see a narrowing of opportunity for display by those outside the imperial family. Non-imperial elite shifted their munificence to other cities in Italy, and the benefaction of especially central Rome became an imperial prerogative. But that did not mean of the emperor alone. At the same time, we can observe an expansion of the number and type of family members who do such building and renovating, and among the earliest women was Octavia. I'm referring here to the portico of Octavia, which will hopefully appear behind me. Located, as I'm sure you know, in the southern campus marshes, where Octavian/Augustus had been renovating Republican temples. A theater for which Julius Caesar had cleared space many years earlier was also dedicated in 13. The theater was named in honor of Octavia's son Macalester. So this is this theater. He had died 10 years earlier after marrying his cousin Julia, but before having achieved any particular civic or military honor in his own right. So this monument itself marks a contrast with the great structures of the Republic, which were all referred to by the name of the builder if their names recalled any particular human individual at all. The Porticus Metelli, the Theater of Pompeii, the Basilica Aemilia, the Sancta Julia, and the like. This naming of a building for someone else was, to my knowledge, unprecedented, and for a deceased but rather unaccomplished family member, also revealing. He's 19 years old at his death. His status is ascribed simply for being part of Augustus's family. In turn, the portico closest to the theater, probably the former Porticus Metelli, was rebuilt and renamed Porticus Octaviae. The association of portico and theater is a common one in Roman architecture. We see them built together in the Theater of Pompeii, for example. The colonnade serves as kind of a lobby, little bit of cover from the rain, a place where you could have temporary food stalls, all the things you want from the lobby of the theater. The architectural complex of the Theater of Macalester and the Portico of Octavia together reveal a developing imperial family in the later years of the 10s BCE, and it sets significant precedents moving forward. Octavia's precise role is perhaps a little unclear. Her contemporaries Ovid and Livy state that Octavia herself finished the theater and the portico as a monument to her son, but later sources attribute the work to Augustus, so it's a little muddy. All the written sources attribute the school and library inside the portico to Octavia herself. So she's also probably responsible for decorating it with famous works of art, a collection that is detailed to some degree in Pliny's Natural History. What survives to be seen now is the monumental entryway, or propylon, that's from a post-fire reconstruction in the Severan period, so it's much later, although Lauder's extensive study concludes it was rebuilt largely along the same plan as the original Augustan structure. If it would have been unprecedented for her brother to name the building in her honor, it was even more unprecedented for a woman to sponsor a public building and name it after herself. An interesting anecdote survives about the theater's decoration that helps us see some of the politics at play. The Skynephrons incorporated 4 large columns that Marcus Aemilius Scaurus had imported from Greece in 58 for the facade of a temporary wooden theater, but they had then used to ornament his own house. This display of tearing down Scaurus's domus and giving the columns back to the people belongs in the context of Augustus's work to reassert the proper moral boundaries between family and public life, work that probably led to women being depicted on coinage only very rarely, as I was just discussing. The Romans associated columns in particular with public architecture, so giving them back to the people chastised Scaurus's inappropriate appropriations of public property, the kind of thing that had destroyed the res publica, and demonstrated exemplary behavior. Filling the portico and library with paintings and sculpture similarly returned to public view that which had recently been hoarded in private collections. We thus see in these new monuments a step toward a public role for members of Augustus's private family as models of aristocratic, or probably even better, imperial public duty. I think we also see here Octavia seizing the opportunity to carve out a new public position for herself. Augustus's marriage legislation, passed just a few years before the theater was dedicated, had stressed the civic responsibility of men and women to have children. In this theater and portico complex named for herself and her son, Octavia celebrates her maternity. The artwork selected for the portico includes paintings and sculptures of many matrons, particularly of Juno, and Juno's temple is enclosed in the portico, so that makes sense, but also many statues of Venus, mother of Aeneas, of the Julians in Rome. Festus tells us that the temple of Jupiter held a statue of Tarpeia, a woman famous for choosing foreign gold over public good, not unlike Scaurus, the column thief. Tarpeia forms a stark contrast to the last image, This particular portico had already contained the only honorific public statue of a woman known from the Republican period, a bronze of Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, and this may have even attracted Octavia to the project in the first place. Cornelia is a particularly fascinating comparandum for Octavia, a woman famous for, in her case, a pair of political sons, her fertility in producing 12 children in all, whose education and marriages she prioritized over her own remarriage, even and importantly, turning down a proposal from a Ptolemy. Oh, she's so much better than that. All these publicly celebrated motherhoods helped Octavia communicate her role and transform her into a model matron on an imperial scale. The location and use of the complex further help underscore the public nature of this role. The mother and son relationship was not one usually associated with the southern campus marshes. This is the marshalling ground of Republican triumphs, with monuments that memorialize them. Triumphs continued to process through this district and even through this theater in the empire, and the associations with military victory cannot be underestimated. Quintus Caecilius Metellus originally put up the portico that Octavia later rebuilt to house spoils from his 2nd century Macedonian campaigns, including the Granicus monument. We should see as military booty those columns, sculptures, and paintings returned to public view in Octavia's monument. Keep in mind that Augustus's family had pretty much created a monopoly over the military at this point. Tiberius, Drusus, and Agrippa were his main generals. His family provided and deserved celebration for military victory and the peace that it provided at home. In their role as mothers, a newly politicized status, women like Octavia contributed to these successes of the family of state. Octavia helped create one of the first permanent memorials of this in the cityscape. As Margaret Woodhull concludes about the complex, quote, Octavia's benefaction helped shift the character of the region from a staging ground for individual displays of power by men to a tableau of familial largesse. The monument also established a powerful, if short-lived, precedent for women of the empire. According to Cassius Dio, Agrippa's sister, Vipsania Polla, also built a porticus to the east of the campus Martius, although we know very little about it. Livia was next to follow suit. Livia and her son Tiberius dedicated a porticus in 7 BCE. Only minor archaeological traces survive, but its outline has been located on the Severy marble plan, so you can see it leaning here, and some of its shape. And it's above, I'm not tall enough, but it's above the baths of Trajan. You can see Porticus Louii. Let's see. The parallels with Octavia's structure are striking. A portico, a mother, a son, private luxury converted to public use, since the property used was the lavish private estate of Vettius Pollio on the Clivus Suburbanus. The new public colonnade was filled with gardens, works of art, and military associations, since our sources report that Livia and her son dedicated the structure in January in association with Tiberius's triumph. The best preserved descendant is the so-called building of Eumachia in Pompeii. With its central, open, rectangular space, colonnaded gallery, and many niches for art, the basic layout of the Pompeian structure resembles other porticus on the Severan marble plan, and the building seems to have served as a public hall, market, and meeting space. This is where it is in the forum, just off the forum, but it's very much a portico shape. This is a reconstruction and the location of a portrait statue of Eumachia. And here is where the inscription is from, out front. The inscription above the entrance from the forum makes the association with the Augustan porticos in Rome explicit. Eumachia, the daughter of Lucius, a public priestess, in her own name and that of Marcus Numistris Fronto, her son, built with her own money and dedicated lots of things, and then the covered walkway and porticos to august concord and pietas. I'm not going to go into all the ways the inscription and the dedication evoke Augustan monuments, but the quadriportico shape and the mother-son pairing are unmistakable. Eumachia's public benefaction and her permanent boasting of said benefaction are very different than what we have as evidence of what earlier women in Pompeii are building. And her, I would argue, explicit comparison of herself to imperial women in the capital reveals the role they played in changing the rules for other aristocratic women. Finally, while the portico may not have remained the exclusive or even favored structure, epigraphic evidence confirms that the benefaction of civic monuments by women increased dramatically over the following century or two of the Roman Empire. So I am concluding, you'll be happy to hear. The title for the seminar this term, Gender and Sexuality from Libya to Theodora, is provocative in that it carves out the empire as a discrete period in the history of gender and sexuality in Rome. That the wars created changes in structures of gender, empire, and autocracy in some mutually reinforcing ways. If that's right, then the beginning of the period should be a time of firsts. I think looking at Octavia's activities, how they diverge from earlier practices and sometimes set precedent moving forward, helps make that case. I should note, I am not crediting her as an individual with all of these moves, right? Who made the choices is often beyond our ability to reconstruct, but although I don't think we need to deny her agency in some of these activities either. It's just difficult to see. But her life experiences do help us see those choices and how the experiences of the civil wars and the development of an imperial family created permanent changes. Yet another way to pose the question of the First Lady is to adapt the rather trend-setting question of one feminist historian, namely Joan Kelly, who in 1977 asked, did women have a renaissance? Did elite Roman women have an empire? The life of Octavia, particularly in terms of how she moved about the empire and left permanent memorials to her presence, answers a resounding yes. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.